Good evening, everyone. I'm Cristina Cesarreta, Manager of Adult Programs here at the Dallas Museum of Art. And I'd like to welcome you all to our lecture, Fools and Folly in Flemish Art. As part of the DMA's current exhibition, Saints, Sinners, Lovers, and Fools, 300 Years of Flemish Masterworks. Organized by the Denver Art Museum in collaboration with the Rebus Foundation in Antwerp, known as Belgium, Saints and Sinners presents more than 130 works of art from the Foundation's rich collection of Flemish masterworks that illustrate the remarkable advances in art production that took place in Flanders from the 15th to the 17th century. This traveling exhibition explores a rich repertoire of subjects that reflect the social change of time while skillfully reflecting the contemporary circumstances surrounding the human condition. This unique representation of works of art involves visitors in the detailed and sometimes passionate narration of Flemish masterworks such as Hans Memling and Peter Paul Rubens. And now I'd like to introduce you all to 𝘍𝘍𝘆 𝘠𝑚𝑏 our newly appointed Lillian and James H. Clark Assistant Curator of European Art, who will introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Larry Silver. 𝘠𝑚𝑏, a specialist in the arts of medieval Europe, joins the museum following a fellowship at the Yale Center for British Art and is currently completing her PhD in History of Art at the Yale University. Under the director of Nicole Myers, she will oversee the research exhibition program and collection development of the DMA's historic European painting and sculpture from Greco-Roman antiquity to the 1700s, with a focus on the museum's early modern holdings. Now please join me in welcoming 𝘍𝘍𝘆.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Larry Silver. Dr. Silver is the Farquhar Emeritus Professor of Art History at the University of Pennsylvania, a specialist of the arts of Northern Europe during the Renaissance and the Reformation. He has published widely on Flemish and Dutch art. His expansive scholarship includes numerous studies on painters like Bosch, Bruegel, Matisse, Rubens, and Rembrandt. His exhibitions include Graven Images, The Rise of Professional Printmaking in Antwerp and Haarlem, and grand-scale monumental prints in the age of Dürer and Titian. He previously served as president of the College Art Association and as president of the Historians of Netherlandish Art. One of his most recent books, titled Europe Views the World, takes a global perspective at the period between 1500 and 1700. Dr. Silver's talk today is titled Fools and Folly in Flemish Art. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Silver back to Dallas.
Let me know if at any point you can't hear me, but I want to thank the Dallas Museum for wonderful hospitality and the opportunity to speak tonight. We're supposed to give trigger warnings as professors now, so for those of you who came here hoping to hear about saints, I don't have any. I am talking about the other guys, the sinners, the lovers, and the fools, and you'll see them in considerable numbers as we go along. Beginning in the late 15th century, Flemish art, in both panel paintings and also the new medium of print, brought ordinary humans and even playful animals to the center of art, and were used basically to show us and to warn us about the misdeeds of fallible humans. And Peter Bruegel's peasant dance that you see on the screen is a good example of that from the late 1560s. The guiding concept of that new art about human behavior or misbehavior is folly, personified in the figure of the fool himself. This is one of the pictures in the exhibition. Now, there were court wits who were fools or jesters, but there were also buffoons and even madmen who were part of the world of folly, especially in European courts. And I'll come back to this guy a little bit later. Driven by instinct and subject to temptations of all kinds, the fool destabilizes order in society and introduces chaos and confusion but can still provoke laughter, and that's what the pictures often are meant to do. This fool and his folly could certainly be viewed as humorous, but also as an instructive negative example. As the Latin for that is the exemplum contraria, a contrary example of a normal world suddenly turned upside down. In King Lear, Shakespeare declares that jesters do often prove prophets. And just as many a truth is spoken in jest, so do many jokes have a sting in them to provoke instruction or even painful self-reflection in their recipients. Now, beside the fool, popular culture also can introduce the topsy-turvy world of social inversion. In particular, we see this in America in the excesses of carnival, such as our own New Orleans Mardi Gras. And that begins to reveal the structure of the rest of the year and normal order. Here's another print by Peter Bruegel, the Festival of St. George's Day, which is like Mardi Gras, a once-a-year day. At the bottom of the social pyramid, the laboring peasant who lives far from the urban life of those people who were audiences for art could offer an unsophisticated baseline test case due to the connection through his labor with the natural world. Peasant leisure, according to these urban stereotypes, opened possibilities of unrestrained pleasure-seeking through drink, gluttony, lust, and anger. And you can see a lot of that over here on the right outside the tavern. But you can see dancing and contests, and you can also see images of little children being led astray by various mischievous characters. Now, Peter Bruegel wasn't the first artist to give his principal attention to the unrestrained revelry of peasants, but he's enjoyed intense popularity in our day and also shows a wide spectrum of conflicting interpretations in the literature written about him. In many ways, this whole study that I'm going to present to you tonight arose out of a Bruegel debate. Looking at pictures like this, scholars wondered whether the peasant festivity was meant to have us laugh with the peasants and enjoy their misbehavior and celebrations, or to laugh at them and condemn what they're doing. So there's a challenge in how to interpret these kinds of pictures, and they present a case study of how to assess the larger significance of the new development of showing human folly as the main subject of art. As we'll also see at the top of the social pyramid, even aristocrats can indulge in excesses and folly and abuse their wealth and privilege. Let me go back to this guy. Well, it's not going backwards. There he is. If, as the Bible has it, the number of fools is infinite, that's Ecclesiastes, or Cicero in ancient Rome declared that all places are filled with fools, well, then it follows that humans will inevitably be crooked rather than straight, maybe even incorrigible, and they'll often display their folly for all of us to see. It seems that folly must be embedded in human nature, and we're all potentially fools, at least sometime, or have some folly within us. And that's the message of a tract from just this period by Erasmus of Rotterdam, his little satire called The Praise of Folly, where Folly herself does the speaking. How then should one view these images of transgression? Should we adopt or should we abandon adult responsibility? Should we maintain or should we disrupt social order? An occasional silly, humorous departure from norms actually reinforces those norms as Mardi Gras leads into the festival, or not festival, the holiday period of Lent. So the humor of these fascinating images and the very character of genre art depends on our recognition that these aren't quite ordinary characters in action, even though they seem basically drawn from everyday life. We're not dealing with pictures of religious figures, mythical figures, or even heroes here. So these actors are defined by what they're not. In fact, they're often anonymous, and they're often represented with the visual trappings of overt satire. They're estranged from us, sometimes with their comical body types or facial features, sometimes by their outlandish costumes, which you also see here. So they can't be confused with us, their viewers. Let me go forward. Here are some 17th century examples too. Jacob Jordaens, a protege of Rubens, who's visible in the exhibition, painted this picture of a Dutch saying, and we'll see more about Dutch sayings later on. Or even more obviously funny, this one by Jan Steen in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam tells us basically, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree, or as the old sing, so the young pipe. And you can see if you don't set a good example at home, if you're drinking and making music and overindulging, your children will do the same. They'll take up pipe smoking or drinking or any of those other good things. As for real fools in 16th century life, you can see representations of them. This is one of a pair of woodcut images which depicts actual court jesters from the early 16th century at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who died in 1519. And they demonstrate just how costumed fools performed as part of entertainment. The first cart that you see here is of jesters. They're defined by mental cleverness, and as well as physical antics such as juggling or acrobatics. And they're different from the second image, which is called natural fools. These are usually mentally disabled people who are exploited as objects of ridicule and seen as comedic. Now that first group gestures wildly and wears, let me go back. I'm having trouble getting the slides to advance. Let me do it this way. Okay. So that first group, we see the jesters gesturing wildly, wearing elaborate costumes featuring gold chains and insignia to mark their court status. The canopy of their court is topped by a small ape and is adorned with bells, a frequent marker on the costume of a fool. And these monkeys that are on the top of the cart link the jesters with animal behavior. The second cart is drawn not by stately horses, but off-screen by donkeys, indicating their lower status. And these natural fool figures play idly with instruments, including humble instruments like the mouth organ that you can see over toward the right here, sometimes called a Jew's harp. So their world is ornamented with leaves, suggesting that their condition as fools is determined by nature rather than by cleverness. Now, sometimes physical deformity, especially dwarfism, define the identity of a court jester. And these are two paintings from near the middle of the 17th century by Diego Velázquez of the court fools of the Spanish king. And that's often the basis of where fools come from. So now let's go back to our poster child, if you will. The artist's name is Quentin Metsys, and he painted this isolated figure with fool's cap, which should make us understand him as a personification of folly itself. Now, he's ugly, and he's a wrinkled old man with a very big nose, so that probably already tells you that it's a negative image that you're supposed to think is pretty funny. But it doubtless was softened in his own eyes by the folly Erasmus talks about of self-love. Vanity makes him not quite realize he's a fool. But his costume clearly conforms to that of a fool. He has a hooded cloak, almost like a monk, which displays two ass's ears, plus the head of a crowing cock that emerges from the top. And sometimes you'll just see a rooster comb instead of an actual cock. And at the crown of his head, that cock is obviously defying his own call with his finger over his mouth, calling for silence. It's essentially betraying him. Now, he has bells on his belt, which you can see, and he carries this long stick, which is called a marot. It's kind of a mock scepter, which makes fun of the person who rules him at court. And at its top, there's an armless figure with very similar ass's ears. But more importantly, this figure is mooning us. He bears his bottom. Metsys's fool is possibly the personification of folly itself, and he confronts the viewer at close-up half-length, almost like a portrait presentation, while he warns us about the importance of keeping silence rather than speaking foolishly. Here's another proverb. Even a fool is counted wise if he keeps silent. And this particular fool actually has an inscription in Dutch that says, keep your mouth shut. Yet his bells provide us with a warning that he's coming, and those ass's ears on his head mark his stupidity, whether real or imitated. And the bump on his forehead is important. That's the mythical stone of folly, which supposedly presses down on his mad mind and causes him to behave foolishly. And there are other contemporary pictures, which I don't have time to show you, that has quack doctors who are removing these stones from gullible fools who think that they can be cured by these quacks, by having the stone cut out. So that cock on his head defies his good advice to keep silent and spoils the basic virtue that might otherwise happen. But the other thing that you should know about the Marat is that it acts like a ventriloquist dummy. So if he says something that insults the viewer or displeases the court for which he's jester, he can always blame it on his Marat. Now, if, as the proverb has it, the number of fools are infinite, let me do this again. We can see a kind of gathering of fools, imagined, of course, but a feast of fools by Peter Bruegel, right around the year 1570. This one has a long inscription underneath that underscores the universality of folly. And the text plays with the word bol, B-O-L, which is the Flemish word for balls, and you see lots of balls on the ground, but it also means bald-headed people, and you see lots of them as well. So the print intersperses the balls with bald heads. And if you look at the costumes here, you'll see the same thing we've been talking about, coxcomb and ass's ears, wherever you see a fool. Now, we have to see this as a kind of staged allegory of how folly is everywhere rather than an actual event. But we can also find some tip-offs. This fool seen from the back actually has an owl perched on his left hand. That's a negative symbol in Flemish art. We'll see another one in a moment. Because owls, as birds who fly by night, are associated with evil as well as stupidity. It's not the owl as the image of wisdom that we get from the Greek tradition of Athena, but rather the owl as a tip-off that this is all meant to be seen as foolish. The same guy, by the way, with his other hand, it's hard to see in this slide, is making an obscene gesture where he puts his thumb between his fingers. That's the same as shooting the bird in our current society. It's called The Fig of Spain by Shakespeare. So now we've got the standard image of the fool established, and we find him reappearing in various settings of misbehavior. Sometimes he's a foolish participant, sometimes he's a commentator. So, for example, here on the left, The Fool and the Girl by the engraver Lucas van Leyden, 1520. The old title figure is driven by lust, and he's just as ugly an old man as we've seen so far. And he's attempting to embrace a young woman who is clearly reluctant to encourage his advances. But at the same time, she's casting her eyes downward and her right hand to the very large coin purse at his belt. Now, he's carrying a marat. You see it here. And he's, of course, wearing the coxcomb on his cowl, so we know he's a fool. But this is a standard mismatched combination of the two sexes with an old male and a young female. His vice, of course, is lust, but her vice is greed. And this is a theme known as unequal love, or the ill-matched pair. And you see it again on the right, a painting by Quentin Matsys. And this panel, by the way, is in Washington, so it might be something you'll get a chance to see. Here we have another lustful old man, based on models from Leonardo da Vinci, by the way, embracing a cunning young woman who has stolen his purse. And you have to follow. He is copying a feel with his hand, but it's as if his arm is extended into her slyly hidden hand, and she has taken his coin purse, and look who she's giving it to. A fool with a coxcomb and ass's ears. Now, the gender poles of such unequal couples could be reversed, where an old woman is seduced by an avaricious young gigolo for her money, but more frequently it's a dirty old man, just the way you see it here. And this behavior overlaps with biblical subjects. Think about Samson and Delilah, or David and Bathsheba, or even Adam and Eve, where the power of women with female beauty overcoming masculine reason and physical strength is at the heart of the downfall of the men in question, especially Samson. Now, in Matt Seise's Washington painting on the right, the fool is an accomplice, but in other works, he sometimes is an observer who tells the truth. So this is also by Lucas van Leyden, but here the fool is in the window with a cartoon balloon that says, look how this is going to turn out. And this young man, not a dirty old man, but a young man, is being seduced by this woman, and if you follow her hand, it goes to his wallet. And she's probably a prostitute because this old woman is probably a procuress. Like Quentin Matseis, Jan van Hemesen sought out biblical resonances for his social commentary, his criticism of sex, sin, and excess as folly. This is a work of 1536 in Brussels, where he adapts one of the parables of Jesus about the prodigal son. Here we see the prodigal son in a tavern, surrounded by a dense press of temptresses who are seeking to exploit his monetary possession of his inheritance. And here Hemesen is playing, just as Matseis did, with intertwined arms. It's almost a visual puzzle to figure out whose arms go where. And he also has a crowd of rather unsavory accessories. We have gambling with dice here, we have a man drinking here, and here's our procuress figure in the corner, just smiling. And bagpipers, by the way, like the man in the upper corner, that's the instrument of peasants and often associated with fools as well. So this is a world in which sin and temptation and folly are in our face. But this one also has a little of the biblical story in the background, where after he loses his inheritance, he's tossed out of the tavern. He goes in humility to live among the swine, but he's finally welcomed back as a repentant sinner by his father, who kills the fatted calf in feasting at his repentance and return home, which is the message of Jesus for repentant sinners. But Van Hemesen in the foreground captures our attention by featuring the sin, not the hidden denouement in the background. Now, taverns and brothels are sites of love for sale by prostitutes. This is also by Jan van Hemesen, and this is where we would expect to find excessive drinking and smoking. And here's our procuress with the young woman trying to convince this old man to play cards or do worse. We see a young man in the background. And by the way, a birdcage on the outside of a tavern is the same as a red light in our culture. We also find smaller versions of the same thing, with these men with fashionable slashed costumes that soldiers often wore, but we see couples going to bed or going upstairs to bed in the midst of this tavern. Another work by the same anonymous master shows us a couple coming down from upstairs, but it's also a world in which anger and other kinds of hostility can play a role, as these two young women are fighting with each other, and there's the birdcage. So we're beginning to see lots of scenes with figures in taverns and small-scale figures who are acting out various kinds of misbehavior, including anger, as well as drinking, overeating, sex, and gluttony. Now, Prince could carry much of this same kind of critique, especially of erotic desire. And here's a print by the son of Quentin Matseis, whose name was Cornelis Matseis, best known as a graphic artist, which shows us another scene of tavern eroticism. This one is marked off with peasants who are often the butt of folly jokes. We see an actual fool here with his marat, who's looking on rather astonished and in a way meant to include us in amazement at the spectacle before him. He also provides the text in Dutch so that the people who bought this print could read it in their own language. And here's what it says down below the print. There's good business here by all reports, and everything will be sold before it's over. So what we have is two simple men, peasants from the countryside, who are embracing a couple of women in the tavern, loose women, and a pair of other women are busy going through, in one case, their pockets, in another case, their baskets of goods. So they're being essentially fleeced by the eroticism and temptations of drink in the tavern. The text of the print notes that these peasants have sold their goods before they even got to market, and that they were paid in services before they got any money for it. And the wall of the tavern also gives us a print with a further commentary. It's kind of hard to read from a slide, but it's meant to be a kind of clue to the contents of this work and to other follies. It shows another peasant, a man, sitting on 2 eggs among chickens. What do you suppose that's about? Well, it's based on another Dutch proverb, and that which reads, "It's a great sorrow where the hen crows and the rooster doesn't." Now, this is obviously a comment on emasculated male dominance in the household, and it casts a further negative light on these 2 men who've come from the countryside and are getting fleeced. But it also points to the resourceful initiatives and the feminine wiles of the bar girls who are taking their stuff. Now, we get some of that already in these 2 prints. On the left, let me point to the musical Old Couple of 1524 by Lucas van Leyden. Now, if you think about it, the idea of a couple making music is about marital harmony, right? No matter what the age of the couple is. This is quite an old couple. And sometimes in group portraits in Dutch art, you get a family out on a terrace playing musical instruments to show what a harmonious family it is. Well, not here. Closer analysis indicates that the tuning of instruments shows the man adjusting the pegs of his instrument as the woman is bowing the note for him to follow on her violin-like instrument. So in Lucas's engraving, it's the wife on the viola who sounds the note that her husband has to echo on his lute. And in short, she is the one who calls the tune, which he in turn must follow. We can see the same relationship in their faces. Her old toothless visage looks out sternly at us, whereas his heavy face shows downcast eyes, listening for the right note to be sure, but also revealing an obvious measure of submission to her will. He's also wearing house slippers, which tells us that he's been domesticated, instead of the clogs of outdoor activity which lie idle next to him. And that makes him what the Germans call a 𝘠𝘠𝘆𝘆𝑗, a slipper hero, that is to say, a man who's basically domesticated and kept around the house. And if you look at the print on the right, by an artist named Israel van Meckenham around 1500, we see the relationships between men and women in a very different light. He did a series which is usually called Scenes of Daily Life. And that's a group of 6 prints. I'll show you another one in just a second. The most overt of them is this one, and it's called The Angry or the Evil Wife. It's also called The Battle for the Trousers. And what we have here is an aroused woman who's striking her male companion, beating him up, really, in order to secure that funny little bit of odd clothing that's on the ground. Now, you may wonder what that is. It's his underwear. These are his undergarments, and the battle really is about what we call in English, who wears the pants in the family. Well, he's clearly losing, like the 𝘠𝘠𝘆𝘆𝘆 husband at the left. And as a weapon, the woman is brandishing the spindle of a weaver, which is very much a tool of domestic industrial production or cottage industry. And that's a reason, by the way, why unmarried women are still called spinsters in English, because they spend their time spinning. Now, normally such a spindle requires stationary sitting and calm demeanor, so to use it as a weapon violates not only the normal, docile, gendered identity of the good woman, as this art might have it, but it also inverts it here into a show of force, which is usually associated with masculine power. Significantly, she doesn't do this just on her own. She's being egged on to do it by a demon who flies above her. And she reveals her transgressive nature if we look at her by her wild, flowing hair instead of a nice, neat little bun that she could have. This is almost the way witches are sometimes shown, and so this is an image that comes very close to the edge of seeing this woman in the power of that demon. And her breasts are spilling out of her dress. There's no modesty here. This wife is what we call a virago, which is the Latin term for an active man. Vir is man and ago is active. So this woman has taken the active role and taken over the household. Let me show you another print by the same artist, 𝘍𝘭𝘦𝘮𝘪𝘴𝘮, from the same series, the one on the left. This is called The Juggler and the Woman, and it shows us another mismatch. This woman is demure, of course, and she's rather distracted as she seems to encourage her mate by touching his hand. He, in contrast, is all activity, in contrast to her passivity. He stands on one leg with the other one lifted up. He balances a small conical glass bottle on his forehead, and he discards his all-important belt onto the ground. There's also been a little bit of drinking going on, as you can see in the corner. In contrast, she wears at her waist a coin purse and keys. Don't know how easy that is to see. But once again, that indicates her authority in the household and her independent responsibility. As I said, that tankard on the ground might suggest that he's already drunk too much, but this print basically shows something that usually is true, especially in teenage years, about how much men and boys will play the fool to get the attention or admiration of women. And fools, by the way, are often associated with particular activities like acrobatics and juggling. Now, earlier printmakers already were beginning to show us this kind of behavior, but in an aristocratic environment of courtly love and luxury indulgence. And we see a couple playing chess here. And we see a young woman making a love garland for her lover. But we also, in the corner, have a fool, whom we can begin to recognize by his cowl. We also see a lady reading a document with him. And here, too, the animals are often courtly. Several falcons, the hunting birds of noble leisure, perch in the trees and fly above. But also, once again, we now know that the owl is not a good sign, that he's the ominous bird of night, despised by birds of day, and he frequently indicates the potential for sin and folly. Now, games are also part of all this indulgence and folly, and they often turn into a battle between the sexes. If you look at Meckenham's engraving on the left, you see a card game between a young woman and a young man. In this case, it's a rather ordinary domestic interior rather than a big garden space, but the young man is still dressed in pretty fancy costume. He has pointed shoes and long hair. And he wears a distinctive hat of a gentleman. There's another wine cooler in the foreground to make everything go smoothly. But this game has reached a point of intensity. The man is raising his hand in a strong gesture of surprise and distress, while his female antagonist at the table is smiling, anticipating her soon-to-be-accomplished victory. Now, we've already met Lucas van Leyden as a printmaker, but he also was a painter of games, especially card games. The one on the right is from around 1515, and it shows a trio around an outdoor table, which makes at least some reference to that courtly tradition that we briefly saw a moment ago. At the left, we have another young man in fashionable dress and a frontal woman who turns to him from the center. But we also see an older man at the right across from him. So this game poses another possibility of an unequal couple, especially if the prize is the woman herself. But in this case, as usual, 3 is a crowd. This game clearly involves gambling besides the cards themselves, because we see coins sitting on the table, not so easy to see in the slide. And unlike the engraving on the left, this is not a direct battle of the sexes per se between one man and one woman, but it's a rivalry. And as the woman's glance reveals, her young suitor will probably win. His king is even stronger than her jack. You can't read that from the slide, but if you get close to the picture in Madrid, you can see it. And in her affection, he's likely to win as well. Now, Lucas also did more crowded scenes of various couples playing cards. In this case, we have 3 men, 3 women, and 1 pair that's already a couple that you can see with the man in the red hat. And they populate this scene, which is from around 1517. Now, within the exhibition, I want to call your attention to this wonderful double portrait. It's a rare case in game playing where we actually don't see it as an overtly satirical image of folly itself. This is a work by Jan van Hemesen, whom we've met in those tavern scenes with the Prodigal Son, and it's dated 1532. They're playing backgammon, which the Dutch call trick-track. And those of you who know the game will recognize that this is near the end of the game, and there are dice on the board, which is how you move your pieces. But these are middle-aged figures who are pointing, each of them is pointing to the progress of the game. But instead of being true competitors like the heated figures around the card games that we've been looking at, they seem to be fairly amiable companions, although the woman has more of a twinkle in her eye, and the man looks a good deal more serious and perhaps worried about how the game's going to turn out. Both figures are dressed for real presentation outdoors. They have fur-trimmed garments and fancy costume. And his flat cap is very fashionable for this moment. But it's a domestic interior where they're located. And the table at the lower left has a beautiful bowl of fruits, possibly suggestive of a fruitful marriage, but certainly another marker of wealth because these are all imported fruits for the Netherlands. And at the lower right, we see an imported pet, a beautiful exotic parrot. And parrots, of course, are also known, in contrast to owls, for their intelligence and their longevity. Now, here's a painting from the exhibition upstairs, and the slide doesn't do it justice. I hope you'll take time in front of it to examine it. It's called The Fool's Market. We're not totally sure who the artist is, though it's called Frans Verbeek the Elder, and it's from the same period as Peter Bruegel. It has a myriad of separate scenes, an inventory of human folly. Here the fools are tiny little figures that you can see in bags and on tables, even being brought in on horseback. And these fools are being exchanged by merchants and consumers. They fill baskets as well as sacks. And in the bottom center, we have one tiny fool who climbs on the head of his trader and attempts to cut out the stone of folly from his forehead. In the lower right corner, we have an amorous old fool, right here, who's wearing a fool's cap cowl and another tiny fool climbing up his head. A second fool on his sleeve rings a bell that hangs on him like an earring, and he's embracing his paramour who's dressed like a nun, and she, characteristically, is picking his pocket. Meanwhile, she looks knowingly out of the picture at us. In the lower left corner, there's a religious shrine, but it's not a real shrine because it has an owl in it. In fact, this owl is so stupid that he's wearing glasses. And there are pilgrims who've come to worship at this fake shrine. And this particular combination of the owl with his eyeglasses gives us another proverb. What good are a candle and glasses if the owl simply refuses to see? Making it quite clear that the owl is supposed to tell us how foolish the picture as a whole is. And underneath that same tree, we see these pilgrims who are actually trying to get a little bit of the porridge that's being served by this couple in the left corner. And in the center, characters in various costumes, including a scholar wearing his doctor's cap and glasses to show that he's another fool. They all assemble around a table, and two men in old-fashioned headwear are using a scale to compare fools, right down here. One of them is a churchman with a cross. So this goes on and on. I won't read you all the little things that I was able to see on studying this, although there's one wonderful scene in the background where a lot of these little fools are put on one side of a scale and one human fool is on the opposite side, and he still is more foolish than their cumulative substance. One other point, though, the right corner on the right edge there shows the pleasure center site that we're now very familiar with. It's a tavern with peasant dancers and drinkers. And it even has one fool suspended above that tavern. So we begin to see the elements of folly gathered together in a single picture with these miniature fools along with the actual people acting out folly. And when Bruegel illustrated a print called "A Fool Hatches a Big Empty Egg," he summarized what we've been looking at so far. Shame, you pot-bellied, drunken fools, always licking and drinking. Finding yourself like another fool on a dirty egg, you end up in an empty shell. So that tells us the message that ultimately there's no good outcome from folly. Well, I want to end with Bruegel, who's really the famous guy. And the Bible, especially Proverbs, has many references to fools and folly, particularly as the opposite of true spiritual wisdom. For example, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And Bruegel often will turn to biblical sayings, including the parables of Jesus, to make pictures like the one you see on the screen, which is the blind leading the blind, and they are appropriately falling into a ditch. And there's not much of a difference between especially the short parables like that one and Proverbs. And many parables have become Proverbs through use. A particular one that comes from Jesus but is really a proverb now is to cast pearls before swine. That comes from Matthew, which means to offer wisdom, which in its original context was the spiritual wisdom of Jesus, and to trade it for something else of value to those who are incapable of using it or appreciating its value. In the case of Netherlandish art, and I will show you an example, we get a man right here, not casting pearls before swine, but casting roses before swine, which is the Dutch version of all this. And this is the picture I'd like to end with. It's by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's an amazing, enormous visual assembly of Netherlandish proverbs from 1559, now in Berlin. Now, depending on who's doing the counting, all of these small figures and settings are acting out proverbs, Dutch proverbs, in their own language. The total of proverbs and sayings depends on who's doing the counting, but here's a graph or a chart that shows you it gets up to the teens, 118 it looks like in this particular count. And there was a late 20th century folkloric experiment out at Berkeley with a native Dutch speaker who was his student, and they hauled in a bunch of native Dutch speakers and showed them this picture. And it turns out that almost all of these proverbs could be decoded from the proverbs of contemporary Dutch proverbs. Well, let's begin in terms of detail in the corner. From left to right, we see a hypocritical woman who has water in one hand but fire in the other. We see a man beating his head against the wall. And on top of the same wall, we see a man in armor doing something completely harmless, belling a cat. And in the lower center, which is easier to see in the next slide, we see this man filling in the ditch after the calf has drowned. That's like in Texas closing the barn door after the horse is gone. And above him, there's a woman in red who's putting a blue cloak over her old husband. Well, that's our ill-matched pair again, but the blue cloak has an extra meaning in Dutch, which is to deceive him. So maybe she's got another paramour. And here's our man casting roses before swine, right next to that. If we continue on, we find social distinctions. This well-dressed man has the world on his thumb, like having the whole world in your hand. But this poor beggar has to crawl through this globe of a world because he can't stand up, and the world has him in control rather than the reverse. Now, we do get a little bit of this social differentiation, but most of the people here are either ordinary or they're peasants. Here's a case of a man who is trying to shear a pig, which doesn't work very well. Here's a man who puts a beard on Jesus. Here are two dogs fighting over the same bone. Here's a man crying over spilt milk. You begin to get the idea as we go on. Now, Bruegel also tells us things about power. For example, down here, in our world of corporate takeovers and banks now that are being taken over by other banks, big fish eat little fish. But there also are elements of total stupidity. This man is fishing behind a net. It's not going to work very well. Here are a couple of people who are dropping coins out of their rear ends into the water, a kind of wastefulness. Here's a man who's warming himself by the fire of his neighbor's house. Here are our old friends, the blind leading the blind, right on the horizon. And it goes on and on. This man is mistaking horse droppings for, wait, I'm trying to remember what he mistakes them for. Let me see if I can find it. I can't find it all of a sudden. Anyway, he mistakes them for something a lot better than horse droppings. And we even have, if we go back to the whole picture, we have a very prominent jester type here who has his pants down and is doing droppings onto the world, and it is a world upside down. He's, of course, also been trying to play cards. There's another man who speaks with two mouths, a kind of hypocrisy. This man over here in the water, maybe I should go back one so you can see him better. He's jealous of the sun, and he holds a fan up so he can block the light and try to take his own advantage foolishly. And it goes on and on. One of my favorites is this man who's pissing out a window at the moon. Try pissing at the moon sometime. But it's a hard thing to display in a picture, so he made it also into the sign of a tavern. There's an Aesop's fable here of the fox and the crane. This man is lighting candles to the devil. You get one thing after another in this great Bruegel painting. Now, about the ways of the world, Bruegel uses all these different spaces which are kind of piled on top of one another so he can get the fullest number of fools and their behavior into it. But it ultimately comes down to how we read the world upside down and how we understand folly. Like the hypocrisy, like the deceit, this is folly, but it also oftentimes is the world upside down in terms of social inversion, and that returns us back to the world of carnival. I know I'm beginning to run out of time, so I will cut to the chase. Now, we don't really have an overriding theme that comes from Bruegel's Netherlandish Proverbs, but it's so literal, the way silly things are being acted out here, like pissing at the moon, that these foolish activities provide us with comic appeal, as well as the kind of pleasure of solving what proverb is there out of the possibly over 100 that he gives us. So we get both comic appeal and moral lessons conveyed directly by these proverbs. And it's amazing how he even manages to pair them up, like the man who's shearing sheep and this man shearing a pig, or the poor man versus the rich man, or two people tugging at a single pretzel, or the man who spilled milk. Also, right beside him, he's trying to reach bread on both ends and can't reach either way, which is the idea of stretching to try to expand your income. Now, taken together, it's not too difficult to see deceit, hypocrisy, and stupidity, as well as the mockery of worldly conditions like wealth and status here in one picture. It's sort of the equivalent of pointing in general to all sorts of everyday follies and foibles, but sometimes even outright sins and deceptions. And all of it points to that general weakness of human behavior, which is such an important addition to what art is all about in this 16th century. And as I said, I promised you sinners and lovers as well as fools, and we've seen that some of these people are actual sinners, and certainly lovers are often fools. As the biblical proverb has it, the number of fools is intimate. So I'd like to end with the notion, which is very common in graduate programs in art history, maybe at TCU, maybe at Yale, I'm not totally sure. We always used to wonder whether people somehow resemble what they study. Well, I hope in this lecture I haven't proved that that's true. Thank you very much. And I hope you'll get a chance to spend time in the exhibition where some of these pictures are there. In fact, I have one more to show you. This one takes a little bit of puzzle solving too. They give you what it means in the title and in the caption, but it's a rebus, and some of you may have, in Sunday puzzles and various other things, worked with rebuses. This is, of course, a rebus in Dutch. So the D is just de, which means the. Of course, you see the globe means the world. This is a foot, and it means, the Dutch word for feed is voet, voeden. So the world feeds, and then this is a little viool, and the Dutch word for much is veel, so the world feeds many fools. And look at our ass's ears, pointed hat, and these two fools are interacting. So that's one to look out for in the exhibition too. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take a little time to answer them.
If you have a question for Dr. Silver, just raise your hand and I'll bring over the mic.
Are these pictures of fools, is this a particularly prominent theme in Netherlandish art at this time?
Yeah.
And is it just because people like seeing funny scenes, or
yeah,
why do we think
one
it's
of
there?
One of the things that got me into the study of this period was that, there are parts of the exhibition that could be from almost any country in almost any period. The religious art that comes at the beginning is part of a long tradition, both before and after this moment, especially in Catholic churches. There are portraits, which of course, you can go back to the ancient Romans and the portraits from ancient Rome upstairs in the DMA collection. And of course, people are still doing portraits, albeit, in the 20th or 21st century way. So in a way, the common core of religious or individualized portrait as art is something that could be from any period. Part of the reason I started studying this stuff was because they broke out of that and they start doing things like these pictures of everyday life, not always as satirically as this. There are plenty of images of people enjoying, and still life, for example, enjoying the world around them and making a positive out of it. But there's also this world it's usually called genre painting, which is like the tavern scenes or any of the other subjects or the peasant subjects of either peasants working or peasants at leisure. That's a real innovation in the 16th century, and it occurs principally in Flanders, as this exhibition makes clear. So it is an unusual and it's a novel thing to introduce. In addition to still life and landscape and some of the things that we take for granted when we look at, let's say, Impressionist art. But it goes back to the 16th century. So,
thank you for the wonderful talk. So, would it also be that this subject matter was coming about at this time because it played against the foibles of sin and the fool, and so it made it acceptable to the patrons in the church to paint it as a non-religious subject?
Yeah, one of the things that happens and it happens around 1500, in my opinion, is that, I mean, people have always been religious, and there's a religious component to criticizing sin, or even treating folly as potentially sinful. Drinking, dancing, sex, all those good things. What happens is that the world of religion, which used to paint the holy figures as kind of like you and me, so we could pray and feel that we had a ready channel of communication to the spiritual world, becomes less certain for people. You have some artists and there's a good example in the exhibition, who show hell scenes because they're so insecure about whether their sinfulness or their foolishness will be punished in the afterlife. And this is a kind of spin-off from that insecurity and lack of confidence in the idea that you lead a good life and you'll be rewarded, and that you pray and you will be listened to. So there's much more of a gulf, I think, that begins to grow up. The cause of that is not entirely clear to me, but suddenly art in the 16th century is thinking about the problems of living in the city, being surrounded by money, having temptations of all these kinds that are part of daily life that need to be addressed in art. And so there is definitely a religious component to all of this, and that moral instructive component, but it arises, I think, out of that consciousness that there's a lot of temptation out there and a lot of possibility for getting onto the wrong course and not being able to pray your way out of it or have a guardian angel, if you will. So that's why I think this art also strikes a chord and really gets to be a new element of art making.
Thank you.
Tough questions from the grad students.
I'm giving it to you.
This one might be a crowd pleaser. So you unpacked some of the animals. We've got the parrot, we've got the owl.
Monkey.
Monkey. There were donkeys. One animal that I feel like I always see in these types of paintings, and if you go through the exhibition, you'll see them again and again, is dogs. And can you unpack sort of the role of the dog in these paintings? Like, what are they doing amongst all of this tomfoolery?
Well, there's a wonderful Auden poem, which isn't about a particular picture, but it's based on Bruegel's Fall of Icarus. He talks about dogs doing doggy things. And the whole idea of animals is usually because they don't have a conscience or a superego. And so, they will just do what instinct tells them to do. But of course, they're dogs and they're dogs. Sometimes you have big hunting dogs. Sometimes you have little tiny dogs. You have gendered dogs. Male dogs are more like the hunting dogs, and women are more like lap dogs in a lot of these pictures. And even in medieval tombs, the guy will be standing on a hunting dog and the woman will be, I say standing, but these are those recumbent effigies. The woman will have her lapdog there or something to that effect. So it can vary. The dogs are less pointed in how they're going to behave than, say, a monkey or an ass or an owl. So it varies. And incidentally, about the parrot, it was often associated with the Virgin and with wisdom because it seemed to be the smartest bird. And in fact, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Dutch people thought that the sound that a parrot makes is ave. So they associated it with the Virgin Mary. But dogs, they're often present, but you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Good question.
Thank you.
Not easy to answer quickly.
Hi, I wondered if you see scenes of artists as fools, because one thing these paintings all seem very confident in the artist's ability to reveal everything to us, very confident in their ability to picture a world. Are there scenes of, the foolishness of artists, maybe associated with monkeys?
You're asking whether we know whether the artists were fools?
No, I'm asking whether the imagery of the artist is full of any of these parables, of any of the mockery is ever directed at the artists themselves.
That's a good question. The artists don't very often show themselves in self-portraits in this period. That's more something for the age of Rembrandt. There's a nice self-portrait from the 17th century in the exhibition. Good question. I mean, more often what you'll get is the depiction of a person with a kind of compromising situation. A lot of times, for example, you'll see a young man with a skull, which is a way of making, and in fact, that's another theme that is very closely related to what I've been showing you. It's called a vanitas theme, the idea that vanity, vanity, all is vanity, that death comes to all of us and we should be aware of it. So you often see a kind of contrast between youth and death, one way or the other. It's a late medieval theme that continues through this period. But I haven't seen many artists who literally poke fun at themselves by showing themselves. That's pretty unusual.
I was just thinking of the monkey theme and the monkey as imitator when the monkey appears in the vessel full of jesters.
Yeah, but the artist very seldom shows himself as a jester or, you know, accompanied by a monkey. That's really unusual. And also occasionally monkeys were pets for very rich people, so it's not always in that same satirical sense. By the way, there's also another picture in the exhibition of monkeys at a tavern. It's a whole picture full of monkeys by David Teniers from the 1630s, and but again, he's not poking fun at himself. It's all of us. And they do tend to generalize a lot more in that sense. I don't think it's self-mockery.
Thank you.
Somebody, yeah, she had one.
I noticed a lot of the depictions of fools, at least that we've seen in the exhibition and in this presentation, are rather localized. A lot of them seem to be, you know, Flanders or Dutch. But of course, when I think of kind of comical, foolish characters in a lot of, even if you think about early like American art and a lot of others, often there's the fool being often an other from another location, region, you know, so sort of like Pepe Le Pew and the jokes about the French Nazi, Yosemite Sam's the over-the-top Texan character of the stereotype also feeding into the fool character. And I guess, did they limit most of their fool depictions to their own locality, or did they kind of have their own, or did they often portray the fool, and we just don't have them here, in other parts of the world or Europe?
There certainly are actual court fools in the courts of Italy.
Of course.
And we know their names, and in Germany, which I haven't shown you, there is even a portrait of a very famous fool for the emperor. And actually, a lot of the court fools, you were asking about portraits, there are portraits of fools rather than artists as fools. But fools, in fact, were kind of celebrities if they were really good. And so a few of them got to be quite famous. And that's probably more true in Germany and Italy than it is in the North, where the fool becomes a type, but they didn't have courts in the same fashion that they did in Italy or in Germany. Those had much more the world of duchies and earldoms and smaller principalities that always competed for, you know, palaces as well as the kind of staffing that had fools. Here, they're kind of imitating the idea of the fool, but they don't really have actual fools by name or profession in the same sense. That woodcut that I showed you to make the distinction between natural fools and clever jesters was actually a German print from the imperial court. There's a question way over there.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, do you think that there's any parallels to the foolishness that you see in the paintings today? Like, do you think it's as prominent as they might have saw it back then, with it being like a society cut off from the higher class society? Do you think foolishness bleeds into other societies? And if so, do you think that it's necessary for the society to exist? Or you think it's something we can grow out of as a society?
Ooh, I think that's a philosophical question.
That was a part of my major.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to that question too that I was mentioning when people look at Bruegel's peasants. Are we laughing with them or are we laughing at them? And do we need that? There is, to try to be serious about your question, there is a notion, and it's just as relevant for Mardi Gras as it is for these kinds of behaviors, that you need an escape valve sometimes, a way to let off the notion of proper behavior, which can be so restrictive if it's all rules. And so there are people who've talked about the reasons of misrule and how dressing up funny on a particular holiday or acting out some of these things or pretending, in effect, that the world is truly upside down. There were feasts of fools in some of these Flemish cities where the ordinary people of the town would dress up as the Pope or the king or something like that and be king for a day. So that, in a way, they got a chance to express themselves or vent their frustrations and anger without having to vote for somebody. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who believe that this is a necessary safety valve for society. But I think most of the time it's also kept in a pretty confined, short time period and short spatial area. And sometimes those things became revolutions or minor revolts because people got out of hand. So, you know, it's a pretty fine balance. But it seems to me it's good to be aware that we all have our moments where we cut loose.
My question is about the consumption of these images and the way that people would discourse in front of them. You know, was it a game? I mean, were there, in terms of Bruegel's images, were people sort of, do we have records of them talking in front of them and you know, where they hung and how public they were, or something like this? Do we know that, was it so easy to decode that it wasn't really a game, or was it definitely a part of the kind of afterlife of when it went on a wall that people would discourse in front of them?
This is a really big picture, but we don't know who it was made for. Most of the pictures that you'll see that involve Folly, first of all, a lot of them were prints, which were made in multiple copies, very inexpensive to purchase. And you could paste them in an album, but you could just sort of enjoy them and maybe not even have to worry about saving them that carefully. It's very rare that you get things on this scale. And that might have been for a really kind of niche market of clients, but we only know a few of the people Bruegel painted for, unfortunately. I mean, that's actually both a good thing and a bad thing. You don't spend all your time worrying about the social element of all this. But most of these things were for private consumption as far as we know. But the documentation is pretty thin until you get to later centuries. But most of them are small, and we're pretty sure that they might have been conversation pieces with a friend, but they were private. And you don't get these things in a big public area like a city hall or certainly not a church. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Larry Silver. Thank you all for joining us tonight. If you haven't done so already, please check out the exhibition. And if you would like, please purchase a copy of Fools and Folly in Flemish Art at the bookstore. And I will put in another plug on June 10th.
I get no royalties.
Please buy the book. On June 10th, we will have a lace historian and lace maker who will talk about the two portraits featured in the exhibition that have lace collars, one of them by Rubens, another one is the portrait of the woman by an unknown artist. So that will be on Saturday, June 10th, and her name is Elena Carnegie Lux. So we hope to see you then. Thank you so much.